So when I was a kid, there was a collection of video cassettes that were in the standard rotation of movies that we would watch as a family, VHS. And one of those movies, was one of our family movies, was Back to the Future. Anybody with me? I know I'm dating myself a bit here. Set in 1985, Michael J. Fox plays Marty McFly. Remember the premise. He is in high school. He finds himself in a DeLorean that he doesn't know is actually a time machine, and he accidentally finds himself 30 years in the past and bumps into his mom and dad, who are the same age that he is. And his mission in the movie is to help them fall in love with each other and live happily ever after, and then get back in his time machine to go back to the future to 1985. And if he fails at his mission, it rips a hole in the space-time continuum, because if his mom and dad don't fall in love and live happily ever after, that means that he's not there 30 years later when he gets back to the future. If you had a time machine, if you could go back to anything at any time, in any place, and talk to anyone, where would you go? What would you see? What would you do? Maybe something from American history, maybe something from biblical history. I was a history major for a hot minute in college, for less than a semester, and I've always been fascinated, even to this day, by the invasion of France at Normandy on D-Day. You know, the scale of it, the secrecy of it, the sacrifice of it. I'd want to be there to see it, but probably more like sort of a fly on the wall. Wouldn't want to get too close to the action and put myself in harm's way. If I could go back, there are some things that I would take back. Warn a younger version of myself, not to do mistakes that I've made that have affected me and have affected people around me. You have some of those? I think about, I go back all the way back to Adam and Eve. If I could chop down the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, how different everything else would be till today. I think about my wife, Jackie. We met when we were 28, and I missed out on the first 28 years of her life. What was she like when she was younger? We met at the refrigerator in her mom's kitchen. Her mom was throwing a party. We said about 2 words to each other that whole night. Didn't really have our first date until a year later. And I would go back to the kitchen and I would say, we weren't interested in each other at the time. She brought her boyfriend, by the way. And I'd go back and I'd say, you better look at this face, because you better get used to it, because you're going to see it for a long time. How about you? What would you go back to see and to do? What we have in our text today sounds like time travel. As if Jesus has arrived in John chapter 8 from the past. He says, before Abraham was, I am. And on the surface, that sounds kind of vague to us. What does he mean when he says that? Here's what we're going to do over the next few minutes of our time together. We're going to go back to the past, to the 2 bold claims that Jesus makes in our reading for today. Both highly offensive to the people around him, and both of them have implications for our life today in the present. So we're going to go start in the past, then we're going to fast forward a few months from that moment into the future with Jesus. And for that matter, into our future that is to come. And then we're going to come back to the present finally as we close and make just a couple of brief observations to apply this whole thing to our lives today. So from the past to the future to the present, let's go back to the past. I hope you got your Bible. Open it with me to John chapter 8. And we drop in at the end of an argument that Jesus is having with the Jewish people who had believed in him, verse 31 tells us. By the end of the chapter, they are vehemently opposed to him. They're arguing about his authority and his origin. Let's pick up in verse 56, page 895. Your father Abraham, Jesus says, rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now, Abraham As he's trusting the promises of God, it's like he's looking through a telescope of time into the future, but the details are still too far away to see, though he can see them sort of more up close than he could before. Abraham trusted the promises of God that would come far away into his future. That's what Jesus is saying here in verse 56. He saw my day and was glad. Verse 57. So the Jews said to him, "You're not 50 years old. And have you seen Abraham?" Now, Abraham lived about 2,000 years before Jesus. It's about as far back as Jesus lived before us. They say, "Look, you're not even 50. Pastor Micah, you're not even 50. Though you're close, aren't you? Closer than I am, at least. Did you know, by the way, that I'm actually younger than he is? Fun fact for you. Everybody thinks it's the opposite. I can't imagine why. You're not 50. He's in his early 30s. And yet, have you seen Abraham? What's the big deal about Abraham? Well, Abraham, for the children of Israel, was on the Mount Rushmore of their forefathers. It's, Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Roosevelt for us. It's the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob for them. So it's a big deal when he says in the next verse, verse 58, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Here's what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, before Abraham was, I was, not the past tense. Before Abraham was, I am. Why does he use the present tense? Again, that sounds a bit vague, a bit strange to us. Why the words I am? Well, for the answer to that, we've got to rewind and get back in our time machine and go even further back to Exodus chapter 3. So flip the page with me, go to page 46. Maybe if you grew up in church, this account is familiar to you. Moses has spent the first 40 years of his life in Egypt, growing up in Pharaoh's house, flees Egypt, goes out to the wilderness, spends the next 40 years. We find him here, Exodus chapter 3, tending his father-in-law's sheep in the wilderness. And he has this conversation with God, who calls him out from his sheep tending, calls him to the burning bush. Moses says, "What's going on over here? I got to go check this out. It's not consumed." Lord calls him from the bush and says, "I've got a plan for you. I'm going to send you back to Egypt, to the Pharaoh that you know and to his family, to save my people from slavery." And Moses isn't too sure about this plan. In fact, he's very unsure about himself for that matter. Verse 13, Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them," he's not quite sure of himself yet, not quite sold on God's proposition. "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" I am who I am. For Jesus of Nazareth, back to John chapter 8, to claim to be I am is to do more than just describe his history in some sort of biblical, historical timeline. To claim to be I am is to use for himself what is the personal name of the holy God, Yahweh in Hebrew. And it was so holy, so precious, that the children of Israel wouldn't even say it out loud. They would go on to add consonants to the vowels. Yahweh becomes Jehovah. And this is why, at the end of John chapter 8, they pick up stones to stone him. He's claiming to be the great I am, Yahweh himself. Blasphemy was a capital crime. And he's throwing gasoline on a fire that's already lit. This is the bold claim that he makes, the first one, claiming to be Yahweh himself. But what? What was the spark, the flame that lit that fire in the first place? What's the second claim that he makes that got this whole conversation going? Well, it's the second for us, but it happens first. Let's go back in our time machine and go back a few verses further to the beginning of our reading for today from from John chapter 8. Let's start in verse 31. And the claim that he makes here is nearly as offensive as the one we just saw. Verse 31, so Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, there it is, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered him, we are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone, which is more than just a stretch, okay? How is it that you say you will become free? Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. This claim, to imply that they will be free in the future, say that about that, implies that there is something about their present. That they will be free implies that they are slaves today. In fact, what Jesus is saying here is that you may think you're free on the outside, but you can be trapped, you can be a slave on the inside. And we've got to spend a minute here at this claim, because it has direct implications for our present day today. What does it mean to be free? Because the modern definition of freedom in our culture today is to be free from something, to be free from constraints. That more than just a day off or a good vacation, to be free means to live any way you want to live. And to be the person that you want to be, and no one else gets to tell you who you are or what you should do or how you should live. To be free means to live free from constraints. That's the first, or the definition of freedom, and it's at least two problems with it. The first is that it's complex. It's not that simple. Imagine this. Imagine I go to my physical, and I've got one scheduled for the end of December, right down here at the corner. If I go to the doctor, and the doctor takes a look at me, and he says, look, we ran the numbers in your blood work, and I've got bad news for you. The news is this. According to your blood work, no more sweets for you. And, on the outside, I look free and healthy maybe, but on the inside, the numbers are telling a different story, and that's bad news for me because that means no more Reese's Peanut Butter Cups from my kids' Halloween candy. Now, listen, can we just pull over just for a moment? You've heard me say this before, maybe. Chocolate and peanut butter, the best combination of all the combinations, right? High five me on your way out if you agree. No more Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. But I say, look, I want to be free. I want to eat Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. He says, look, you can eat Reese's Peanut Butter Cups if you want, but you could say goodbye to watching your kids grow up. What's the problem? On one hand, I've got to make a choice to do something that sounds freeing. On the other hand, I get to do something else that feels freeing too. I've got to accept constraints. On one hand, I eat the peanut butter cups, free for me, has a cost. On the other hand, I deny myself, that has a cost, but it frees me to do something else. To simply live free from constraints, there's no such thing. You're always making constraints. You're always making choices in the way that you live, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian today, too. And I want to say that, as soon as I find my place in my notes, to say this, that no matter what I choose, I'll be free one way, but constrained in another. What am I left to do? I'm left to free the more liberating of the two constraints. The modern definition of freedom, it's too simple, and it has the wrong source. That's the other problem. Because in the modern definition of freedom, the enemy is always on the outside. It's always someone else who tells me what I should or what I should not do. Jesus says anyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. He's saying something quite different. He's saying you can be free on the outside, but a slave to your sin on the inside. Because the problem is universal. In every human heart, there's a desire, a voice that's not on the outside, one that's on the inside, a voice that says, no one tells me what to do. And Jesus says, no matter how free you think you are, for that matter, no matter how good you think you are, you're a slave to sin. You're a slave to that voice. Because at the heart of all sin is self-centeredness. No one tells me what to do. In two dimensions, vertically and horizontally. That sin, at its essence, at its core, is self-centeredness. It's rebellion against our design, our designer, for that matter. I have two kids, and sometimes I ask them to do something, and they ask why, and sometimes I explain it to them, and sometimes they ask, well, why? And sometimes, even though I'm giving them all the right reasons, I just have to say, what, parents? Because I said so. Look, what if you obeyed your designer only when you understood why he asked you to do something? For that matter, what if you obeyed only when you agreed with his answer? Do you know what that is? That's conditional obedience on your terms, not his. And you know what it does? When it's on your terms, it makes you the God of your life, and it puts you in his place. So think back to Adam and Eve in the garden. Let's go back there. I mean, they have everything they need, and one command only. God says, you can have everything you want, but one thing, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, lest you die. And they aren't told really why beyond that result. You know, they don't really have no conception of death to that point. They don't really know what it's like. They don't know what will happen. And they agree to obey when it's convenient for them, and they stop when it's not. What if you obeyed only when it was convenient for you, and you stopped when it's not convenient? Because you know what? There's no if here. You're doing it right now. You obey to the point that it's just convenient, and stop when it's not, when it becomes too great of a cost. What if you only obeyed when it's convenient? What if you only obeyed when you agreed? What if you only obeyed when you understood what he said and why it was good for you? First thing, it's upward, it's vertically with him, and it's horizontally with each other. I mean, what if you said, look, I just want to be free. And so I think I'm just not going to go into work today. I think I'm just going to stop going. What would happen? You would lose your job. And what if you said, look, I'm going to lay in bed today. It's what I want to do. I feel free. And you did that, and then you did that again. Eventually, your house would be a mess. And what if you said, look, I'm going to live any way I want. I don't care what anyone thinks. Do you know what that would result in for you? Eventually, at its final degree, how you would find yourself alone. Because at some point you have to accept some limits on your freedom as a spouse, as a son, as a daughter, as a friend, as a worker, as a parent. And if you're honest with yourself, there's a voice in your head that says, I just don't want to. Have you heard that voice? You know how you can tell? When you get angry, when you do or you're asked to do something that you don't want to, when you resist that inward tension that you feel. You see, this claim that Jesus makes here, this second one that we're seeing here, that was the first one in the text, is not just offensive to the audience of Jesus in John chapter 8, it's offensive to us as well, because no matter how free you think you are, and no matter how good you think you are, you're a slave to your own self-centeredness with God and with one another. So how do you move from a slave to a son and a daughter? And the answer is in the Son who sets you free. We've got to fast forward to the future, to the events that lie ahead in the future of Jesus. And the clue for us we find, it seems like a throwaway line at the end of our text in verse 59. Would you look at that with me? It says, so they picked up stones to throw at him. That seems pretty dramatic, right? Things are escalating to this point. But Jesus hid himself, which seems kind of strange, again, kind of dramatic. and went out of the where? The temple. See that? That's not just a throwaway line. John is indicating to us that they've been having this whole conversation this whole time about Abraham and the temple. Why does that matter? Because the temple where they are standing is the same place in the city of Jerusalem that before that, if we go in the Wayback Machine, Mr. Peabody and Sherman, anybody, if you're with me, if we go way back, that's the same place that Abraham climbed the same hills outside on the city of what would be called Mount Moriah. And you remember what happened? The conversation that Abraham had with his son Isaac on the way up the hill. Abraham has been asked by God to sacrifice his son, his only son. And if Abraham goes through with that, and if God doesn't intervene, it rips a hole in the space-time continuum. And that means no Isaac, and that means no blessing through the seed, the generation that will follow Abraham, because he has no children. And for that matter, that means no Jesus. And that means none of us are here today if God doesn't intervene. But he does. Isaac turns to his father and he says, look, I see the wood, Dad. Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham turns to his son and he says, the Lord will provide. How? We don't know. He could know that. He's looking through the telescope of time, somehow trusting the promises of God. He's on Mount Moriah, where he nearly sacrifices his son. He's on Jesus, back to Jesus. He's in the same mount, the same city, the same place, where the Lord provides. Because if this temple is Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, if he hides himself here in the temple, it's because soon they won't need the temple. Because if we fast forward into the future, it's only a matter of months before Jesus will be back in town again for the Feast of Passover, and he finds himself climbing the same hills outside the same city where the Lord provides for you. He hides himself in the temple. He reveals himself in glory on the cross. And what do we find on the cross? We find the great I am, the one who was, who is, and who is to come, the most free being, the most free human in all of human history, submitting himself to constraints, to the will of the Father, physically constrained, nailed to the cross, not in rebellion, but in submission. And what does he do? He isn't content to stay on the sideline. He comes close, he comes near, and he puts himself in harm's way for you, not simply out of convenience, but at great cost to himself for you. To rescue you from death, he lays himself down in death. And I think it's great irony in John chapter 8, verse 53, John records, he must have remembered this years later as he wrote down the account of the life of Jesus. Remember, the Jews say to him, are you greater than our father Abraham who died? And the prophets, they died. What great biblical irony is if Jesus is saying, yep, they died and so will I. I lay my life down only to take it up again. Because if we fast forward 3 days, Jesus is risen, and his death and his resurrection have ripped a hole in the space-time continuum, in the fabric of human history. And because of the death and because of the resurrection of Jesus, all of the rest of us are here today and will be forever. Because he is risen. And if you belong to Jesus, if you believe in him, the one who is the resurrection and the life in him, you rise too. And that's not all. There is a future that is to come. Because on Christ the King Sunday, we join our brothers and sisters all over the world. And we look forward through the telescope of time to the day that Jesus will return. We get a glimpse of it in the scriptures. But what the scriptures show us is enough vague pieces that give us hope about the death of death and the end of evil and the defeat of the evil one once and for all. And the one who returns to wipe every tear from every eye when he steps down into history again. If you belong to Jesus, friends, this is your future. So finally, what does that mean for us in the present today? That means a lot of waiting. It means waiting because we can't jump into a time machine and fast forward to that day. It means a lot of waiting in this broken world until that day. And we can't get back in a time machine and go to the past and erase our mistakes or the things that have been done to us. It means waiting in between these two great events, the first coming of Jesus and the coming that is to come, and that's hard. Let me invite you today to hold to his teaching and to cling to his promises, even when you don't see, even when you're not sure why, and you can't understand. And to trust that he is good, that he is the one who has always been there with you. And he is the one who is with you today. And he is the one who is to come. It means waiting. That's the first thing. And it means obeying. But not simply out of duty. It means obeying out of delight. Because there's a freedom that is not simply from something that constrains us. There's a freedom to something. I'd argue this, if you remember anything today, is that freedom is accepting liberating constraints. Constraints that aren't just duty, because you have to obey your designer. It's not just constraints that are out of obligation to serve your neighbor, but it's to say, I'm willingly giving this thing up for my good because it is for your good, even if I don't understand why, but because you have said so, and I trust that you are good. Freedom is saying, I'm willingly giving this good thing up because I trust that it's not about my good ultimately in the end, it's about your good. Your spouse, your son, your daughter, your mom, your dad, your friend, your boss. And if Jesus can submit to the Father perfectly, I'd argue that you can submit to your father and to your neighbor, to one another imperfectly. And you may not know why. He says so. And you may not agree with him. For that matter, you may not agree with them. But don't wait to do it for your sake. Obey for his sake and for their sake, because he's good. And ultimately, it is for their good too. And as you do you know what you'll do? You'll build what I call, or I've heard someone else say, the muscle memory of obedience. Because there is a muscle memory of disobedience that hardens your heart over time. There is a muscle memory of obedience that softens your heart over time. Hold to his teaching. Know the truth that is not simply duty, but is delight. And when you delight in him and delight in obeying him and loving your neighbor, then he, the Son, will set you free. In the name of Jesus, who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.